welcome you all tonight to Stevenson College at UC Santa Cruz. My name is Jim Carter. I'm the College Administrative Officer for Stevenson College and Cal College. And I'm privileged to stand in for the Stevenson College Provost, Alice Yang, who was needed to be elsewhere this evening. So thank you all for coming and for being here on time. For those of you who are not familiar with a formal debate process, it's formal, it's structured, and we will be here for 2 hours. There will be, I'll tell you the format now, and then I'll introduce the speakers and tell you about the sponsors. But each opening speaker will have 20 minutes with 10-minute rebuttals from each, so that would take about 40 minutes. And then there's some cross-examination that will take, perhaps 10 to 20 minutes. And then there will be a 30-minute period for questions from the audience. And then each speaker will have 12 minutes to make a closing statement. And by that time, it should be close to 9 o'clock. So that's the formal structure. If you have cell phones or other devices that make noise, you might want to please put them on a silent mode, if you would, or turn them off. That would be helpful. The sponsors tonight are listed on some of the flyers that you've seen. They include Stevenson College and several UCSC student groups, which include the Graduate Christian Fellowship, the Secular Student Alliance, the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, A2 Christian Fellowship, and also Institute for Credible Christianity, Center for Inquiry, Atheists of Santa Cruz and Monterey Counties. And for more information, there's a website, crediblechrestianity.org. Let me tell you a little bit about the presenters tonight, the debaters. Dr. Peter Payne on my right versus Eddie Tabash on my left. Let me start with Eddie Tabash. Eddie is a constitutional lawyer in Beverly Hills, California. He graduated magna cum laude from UCLA in 1973 and from Loyola Law School of Los Angeles in 1976. He is a member of the board of directors of the Center for Inquiry Transnational and its affiliate, the Council for Secular Humanism. He is also a life member of American Atheists. His father was an Orthodox rabbi, ordained at one of the most respected pre-World War II rabbinical seminaries in Lithuania. His mother was an Auschwitz survivor from Hungary. After decades of spiritual seeking, he has concluded that we live in a natural universe with no supernatural agencies or occurrences. Eddie Tabash has debated such prominent Christian philosophers as Peter Van Inwagen, William Lane Craig, Douglas Guyvet, thank you, Richard Swinburne, and is looking forward to his second debate against Christian philosopher Dr. Peter Payne. In this debate, he is formally representing the Center for Inquiry and the Council for Secular Humanism. Dr. Peter Payne is a Christian philosopher. Let me scroll down here for a minute. There we go. He is the managing director of the Institute for Credible Christianity. He and his wife, Janet, work with the UCSC Grad Christian Fellowship. He lectures throughout the U.S. and Europe and participates in debates with prominent atheists. Peter served for 21 years with the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, including work with undergraduates at UC Santa Cruz and Stanford, and later at the University of Michigan with IVCF's grad and faculty ministry. Peter has a BA from Stanford, Philosophy 1973. He did graduate studies at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City before completing a doctoral degree at the Claremont Graduate School, Philosophy 1996. Peter and Janet make their home in Santa Cruz, California. I'm also to tell you that you can get DVDs either by ordering them or at the table over here. They're $13. If you order them, $10 plus $3 shipping. There's a timekeeper down here, and I will be watching the timekeeper. And when it's time, if the speakers have not stopped, I will ask them to stop and we'll keep it moving. Please refrain from clapping during the debate. Thank you very much.
We each have the opportunity to give a presentation. Since I'm presenting the positive side, I guess that's the reason why I'm going first. When Eddie gives his presentation, he covers a lot of material. So the challenge is to try to respond to those things. There's no way I could possibly respond to all the points that he will raise in his 10 minutes. So I'll touch on a few of those to begin with. However, start off with the question, does God exist? If you ask a person, does God exist, they wouldn't necessarily that God has to be perfectly good. Many people believe in God, but don't believe he's perfectly good, don't believe that he knows everything, or he's all-powerful. In fact, it's a bit odd to start off with assuming that we ask God exists, to start saying that God must be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. I mean, after all, that's a lot to buy into originally. Some Christian philosophers will think that's a good starting place. But for most people, the reasonable question about belief in God doesn't assume all that to begin with. Many of Eddie's arguments really assume that you have all three of those and problems which can arise from them. But if one asks, does God exist, one has to ask the preliminary question, is it reasonable to think that something like God might exist? And many of the reasons for believing that God might exist, features of the universe that I think are better explainable by belief in God than by naturalism, do not presume that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, or that he's infallibly revealed himself to us in some divine scripture. So keep that in mind as we go along. On the handouts that you have, I have a list of things that are general reasons for believing that God may exist. My point in those is not that naturalists can't give explanations for them, they can. So for instance, one of the reasons is the apparent fine-tuning of natural law. I think most naturalists these days who wrestle with that answer by saying, well, there must be a multiverse, a vast number, infinite number of universes. So the naturalist can respond to these things, but my contention is for each of these points, it's given that theism is true, it's less surprising that this point holds than given that naturalism is true. Another example on the list is that we are conscious beings. We're sort of assume we're conscious beings, no big problem with that. What's surprising about that? What's surprising about that is science as we currently understand it tends to be very reductive. We understand how the brain works in terms of neurons firing, interacting with each other. But how can a complex machine ever give rise to consciousness? That really is a deep enigma, and it's an enigma for science. In fact, there was an issue of Scientific American about 20 years ago that the cover article said, "Will science ever explain consciousness?" And I find that to be a rather unusual title for a magazine like Scientific American that tends to have a very anti-religious bias. And the article was saying, well, maybe we never will. And the reason people think that we never be able to explain it is that even if you understood exactly what it is in the human brain that's taking place when consciousness occurs, you'd still be asking, well, why is that conscious? It doesn't seem as though a physical description ever entails a mental description. In fact, one of the difficulties is there seems to be a conceptual gap between physical categories and mental categories. And no matter how you would arrange the physical categories, it doesn't seem as though it ever entail consciousness. Well, what does one make about that? Does that prove that God exists? No, it doesn't. But I think what it ought to do, it ought to give us some metaphysical humility, as I call it, about the nature of the physical universe around us. Atheists tend to be mechanistic in their way of viewing us. They tend to think of the brain as being a vast, complicated biochemical machine or biochemical computer. But if in fact it was like that and everything was built out of the interaction of parts, my contention is you would never get consciousness. So given this conceptual gap, it seems to me there's two ways one could bridge that. One is to say there really is a substance, a mental substance, not something that operates independently of the brain, because one of the points that Eddie will give is the mind does not operate independently of the brain. But it may well be that there is something, a dualism of substance within us, which are interdependent upon one another, within which the uniqueness of mental characteristics actually do arise from a mental substance which is real and which is different than the physical world around us. It seems to me the other approach to that, which has some real merit to it, is to say that we need to come up with a radical new metaphysics of the natural world. And what I mean by metaphysics is the nature of reality. So we tend to think of the world around us in atomistic terms, of ground up, reductive ways, and my contention is that even contemporary science tells us that's wrong. The world doesn't break down into individual atoms that interact with each other. There's a holism. In quantum mechanics, you have lots of particles interacting with each other. There are no clear boundaries. So there's something very metaphysically strange about the universe. So the question is, how is it that mind can be incorporated into the world? And I suggest that one approach to that is say that we need radically different ways of conceiving the physical world, ways that include the mental. But if they include the mental and somehow you have mental concepts included in our understanding of the world, you don't give a priority to physical concepts and say the mental concepts are just epiphenomena, then that certainly raises the question of whether something like mind is actually rooted in the very nature of the universe itself. Makes one ask, might there be mind behind the universe? So the enigma of consciousness, which Eddie will use as an argument against believing in God, actually I think points in the direction of a quite metaphysically different world than scientists usually give to us. And it gives some reason to think that maybe mind behind the universe is not so crazy after all. On the list I'll mention a couple at the beginning because they imply that the agent behind this universe, if it exists at all, has to be non-material. The first is the origin of the universe, and scientists are grappling with the origin of the universe. How did it come about? It used to be that people were convinced that the Big Bang was actually the beginning of the universe, period, that there was no time and space before that. Actually, a fair number of physicists now think, no, that's not the case, that the Big Bang was not an absolute beginning of time, and that the universe has actually always existed, either in a cyclical form or in a branching universe where our universe, perhaps through black holes, seeds other universes, and it goes on and on forever. Well, either way, there's a great difficulty for the naturalist. If the universe really had a beginning, the question is, how did it get started? It can't bootstrap itself because there aren't any bootstraps to begin with. There's nothing to grab onto. There's nothing to get it going. And atheists may say, well, we simply don't have the answer yet, but the problem is it doesn't seem as though any physical answer, at least in the normal sense, can be given. Plus, sometimes it's said, well, you can get particle and antiparticle pairs popping in and out of existence through chance without there being anything there to begin with. So you can get something out of nothing. And maybe the universe was a quantum fluctuation out of nothing. But you can't get something out of absolutely nothing. Plus, quantum fluctuation depend on quantum mechanics, which is probabilistic. So you ask, what's the probability of a pair of particles popping in and out of existence over a given period of time and within a given volume of space? But if you go back to the moment of the Big Bang, there is no space and time out of which it could have arisen. So it doesn't, even though it seems as though the concept of probability can apply. So if you suggest the universe had a beginning, that there was nothing before that, and you want to know what can explain it, seems to have to be something beyond the universe itself. And hence it has to be something which is non-material, and it points in the direction of God. What if a person says, well, the universe has always existed? The problem with that is it relates to the second law of thermodynamics. In the second law of thermodynamics, the universe in a closed system is always increasing in disorder. Over time, the amount of usable energy gets less and less. If a universe is cyclical, the universe clearly is not an open system. If it cycles, you're not getting new energy put in every time. If there's a big bang, big crunch, or something like that, the cycles don't have extra resources to draw upon. So to believe that somehow the universe has always existed, it seems as though each cycle should be winding down. You should have less and less usable energy. And even if you just look at our universe itself and ask, why is it that our universe started off with as low entropy as it did, that's actually very puzzling. There's a physicist named Victor Stenger who wrote a book called Not by Design, suggested that the moment of the Big Bang, entropy was actually maximal. And then when expansion took place, the ceiling of entropy actually rose. And what we've been doing ever since then is simply moving to catch up with the risen ceiling. So that explains how you could start off with low entropy. You didn't. You start off with maximal entropy, but the expansion of the universe raised the ceiling for entropy. The problem is that there is a person named Roger Penrose, another eminent physicist and mathematician, who says that won't work. That even if you take that into account, it's extraordinary that we have as low entropy as we have. In fact, he does a calculation in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, that if you had by chance a universe starting off with a low enough entropy to have a universe that we see around us now, that the chance of that be 1 over 10 to the 1,200th power. Now that's about as small or as large a number as I've ever heard given that has any kind of meaningful significance. Doesn't mean that Roger Penrose is a theist. No, he isn't. His conclusion is, well, there must be something about Big Bang events, some law of nature that we simply don't have at this point that dictates that a Big Bang has to start with low entropy. Well, that's very ad hoc. It's not anything we have going for us. So even if you think the universe has always existed, there's the problem of the second law of thermodynamics, where it came from. So both of those give us reason to think there's something beyond the universe, something non-material that gave rise to it. And note, none of these arguments thus far assume that you have a God who is omnipotent, all-powerful. You just simply have some reason for believing there's something other than the physical universe. And Eddie is going to argue that, in fact, there's nothing beyond, and belief in the supernatural is irrational, but in fact, there are a number of good reasons for it. Let me skip at this point to ask the general question, is there conflict between science and the Christian faith, or between theism generally and science? And I'm going to maintain that there's not, that in fact science by itself gives no strong support for naturalism. And I'm going to base that argument on a principle. The principle is that for one thesis to receive strong support for some evidence, it has to not only account for the evidence well, two other conditions have to be met. One condition is that there can be no other alternatives that also account well for the evidence, and those alternatives, or at least one of those other alternatives, has some prior plausibility to it. And I'm going to argue that the Christian faith, or classical theism, does in fact account well for the success of science. And I'll come back to the question of prior plausibility that I already started with some of the points that I just raised. So why is it that one should think that the success of science appeals or accords with science as we know it? Let me give an example. Isaac Newton thought that God every once in a while needed to adjust the orbits of the planets to keep them stable. Well, 100 years later, Pierre Laplace showed that no, that's not needed, that Newton was wrong, that physics itself dictates the stability of the planetary orbits. Now, if you were a Christian at that time, should that have been threatening to you? Here's something that even the great Isaac Newton thought God needed to do, and now he's not needed. Should Christians have been threatened by that? And I would argue that no, they shouldn't have been. The reason is that Christians believe that God is all-powerful and that he's all-knowing. And being all-powerful, he can create any possible world, and being all-knowing, he knows all the possibilities. So presumably God could create a world within which he would need to play celestial mechanic. But it's also possible for God to create a world within which physics dictates the stability of the planetary orbits, and we know it's possible because that's the world we live in. Well, it's not generally a rather problematic thing to ask, well, what would God do? Because we are not God. But at least from a human perspective, the much more elegant solution is to build it into physics. If you're an engineer, and cost aside, you have the opportunity of building a machine that needs to be adjusted periodically, or one which is self-adjusting, you're going to build it so it's self-adjusting. Well, why wouldn't an omnipotent, omniscient God build into the universe a universe which is self-subsisting and adjusting, and doesn't need to have someone go in and tinker with it and adjust it? Now expand that argument to everything we see in the normal process of the world around us. The way in which cells divide, the way in which egg is fertilized, the way in which plate tectonics takes place, everything around us, the normal process of nature, I would suggest, are things which do fall out from physics. In fact, I think success of science gives us good reason for believing that is the case. So I'm arguing that there are no gaps in the normal order of nature where God needs to do miracles to sustain it on a regular basis. But now I want to make a distinction between what I'll call order of nature miracles from specific point miracles. An order of nature miracle is one that's needed to sustain the natural order. A specific point miracle is a miracle which is done at a specific point in time for a specific reason. Now the question is, if in fact it makes sense for God to create an exquisitely ordered world where he doesn't need to fill in, keep it running by perpetual miracles or regular or periodic miracles, should we think that God never does specific point miracles? Does the success of science in explaining the natural order give us reason for believing that miracles never occur at all? And I would suggest there is in fact no good inductive argument for that. Now let me give several reasons that a person might say, well, it still is a problem. One is they might say, well, if in fact God does miracles at all, shouldn't they be common enough so that everyone would be aware that they happen? Part of the problem of evil and suffering we'll get on that particular question. But the problem with that is that if miracles are done at specific points by the will of an agent can choose to do something frequently, rarely, or not at all. And there's no a priori way of knowing whether an agent will do something frequently enough for it to be observed by us. So there's no strong argument that says you can go from a lack of order of nature miracles to a lack of specific point miracles. Well, a person might say, well, in fact, we do know quite a bit about God, at least from a Christian and Jewish standpoint. It's not as though we have this absence of knowledge and God may only do miracles occasionally. From a Christian or a theistic standpoint, God does want us to know He's there. And He also cares about us. So shouldn't we expect Him to do obvious miracles quite often? Well, 2 points about that. One is it's not an issue that arises from science itself. They're very good questions, and I will be responding to those in the rebuttal period, the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. But in fact, it's not a problem at all for science. Another objection might be to say, well, science has shown that many supposed miracles, in fact, never happen. Doesn't that give us reason for thinking that they're all frauds? Well, that would be like saying, well, we've shown that many accounts, claims of meeting, encountering aliens were frauds, therefore the possibility of aliens should be dismissed. Well, no. Most atheists actually think there's a possibility that they might have intelligent aliens might exist and they might visit us. And if they only do so rarely, or if they want to be secretive about it, it shouldn't be too surprising that even if they had come, that we wouldn't notice it or that we wouldn't be aware of it. Likewise, if God chooses to do miracles rarely, then it shouldn't surprise us that, in fact, we don't observe they exist. It's also worth noting that according to the Bible, God doesn't do obvious miracles on a regular basis. You might think, well, Christianity implies He should. Well, according to the Bible, you find obvious miracles taking place only through specific individuals and through specific times in history. Well, isn't God being inconsistent? Why shouldn't He do it more often? So it's not just it's not a problem for Christians, but there is a problem of asking why doesn't God do obvious miracles more often? Finally, let me suggest that a person might say, well, the universe you're describing where God developed this exquisite order sounds an awful lot like the atheist universe. And there's a principle called Occam's razor. And Occam's razor says you should go for the simpler explanation. Well, the simpler explanation would seem to be that naturalism is true, because after all, it accounts for the success of science, as does theism. And since you don't have to have God to account for the success of science, just lop God off. So use Occam's razor and cut God out of the picture. Well, that would work if, in fact, there is nothing that theism actually explains better than atheism or naturalism. But the list of things I gave you are things where I think it's more reasonable to expect these things would exist if theism is true than if naturalism were true. So there is no good reason from science itself to believe that God does not exist, and there's no good reason, apart from perhaps the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness, to say that God doesn't exist. One other point I want to raise about science, and something that Eddie will raise, is the problem of consciousness. I already raised that. He argues that he says that if in fact our minds are dependent upon our brains, then we shouldn't expect that there should ever be any immaterial minds or non-material minds. But as I argued before, it seems as though consciousness doesn't reduce down to the material world. So either you have some substance that yes, in fact, is dependent on the physical brain, or in fact, you have something like mind that undergirds the entire universe. It's also worth noting that if we have reason to believe there's something like non-material mind, not being able to understand how it works shouldn't be surprising. Eddie will ask about what's the mechanism by which God thinks. But that's simply asking what kind of material processes does God use? But if you take seriously theism, God is not like us. We are dependent on brains. God is not. God is able to think about all of us simultaneously, and He's not just a complex, multi-channeled computer, but rather He is radically different than us. So it shouldn't surprise us that we don't understand how God's mind works. But given the enigma of consciousness, one shouldn't say, well, the survival of death could never take place. I think the first thoughts that I'll have after I die will be embodied thoughts. I think finite human thoughts are in fact dependent upon a body. It won't be the exact same body that we have now. But if Jesus in fact rose from the dead, which relates to the specific character of the Christian faith, then in fact there is reason for believing that life after death is possible. So consciousness doesn't show that minds have to be embodied. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Eddie, your opening statement?
Oh, thank you all for showing up, and thank you, Peter, for debating me again after 7.5 years. Tonight, I will argue that the evidence in our physical universe clearly makes it much more likely than not that a supernatural, self-conscious personality that is all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, which is the standard issue God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, does not exist. And even if Peter is going to attempt to put over some kind of less than powerful God, that's not the one he believes in, and I will not let him artificially strip down his deity to some bare bones, not all-powerful God, just because he thinks he has an easier time defending it. That would be a camouflage which we won't let him get away with. And so, because my dominant theme will be the lack of evidence of the supernatural and the clear indication from the physical world that the supernatural does not exist. So it's not just God, it's all supernatural, all paranormal claims. I would say the same thing if the opponent this evening were Deepak Chopra instead of Peter Payne. My argument is based upon the weight of the evidence and upon the assertion that naturalistic atheism is the best inference to be made from the existing evidence. I will contend that the universe looks like we would expect it to look on naturalism more than what it would look like with our physical reality on theism. Now let's look at the supernatural. 2,000 years ago in ancient Santa Cruz, green gremlins from the sixth dimension abducted members of the native population and imbued them with special powers, and these people are now the guardian angels of the United States. And it's because of that that people are able to survive the winters in Buffalo, New York, and the traffic in Los Angeles. None of you would believe me. If I said that I didn't get here from LA by airplane but flapped my wings and flew bodily, none of you would believe me. But the biblical supposed miracles are even more outlandish, because this violates the laws of nature as we understand them and violates our empirical understanding of how the physical world operates. Extraordinary claims do definitely require extraordinary evidence. Now, claims of miracles have the initial problem of bearing witness against themselves, since by their very nature they are violations of the very laws of nature that are not supposed to be violated. All the supposed miracles, the one that Peter just talked about in the Bible, used to verify the intervention in human affairs of God, allegedly took place in a pre-scientific era. That is very suspect. Why not today? Why don't we moderns have the same opportunity to observe these miracles today? It's a legitimate question. Talking snakes, talking donkeys, worldwide floods, sun standing still, people turned into pillars of salt. I can see it now. Jesus resurrects, film at 11. Why not? Pillars of salt. That was a ridiculous kind of fairy tale in the Bible. Why don't we see those things happen today? No verifiable event in today's world corresponds to these types of miracles, which would make many of us believers if we saw them now. Look at the Loch Ness Monster in that lake in Scotland. It's not otherwise detectable. Best evidence is it's not there. So we have more evidence that the laws of nature, which a miracle would have to violate, are in fact not violated than we have ever had that a miraculous violation did in fact ever occur. Thus, the probability that a miracle happened, which is a violation of natural law, will always be lower than the probability that the miracle did not happen. Now, Peter was trying to talk about the severability of consciousness from the brain. If that were true, there'd be direct evidence of it. Look at it this way. Alzheimer's, a blow on the head, an anesthetic, shows the dependence of consciousness on the brain. In brain surgery now, they can touch certain parts of the brain and they can stimulate certain memories, or if they destroy certain parts of the brain, they can destroy certain memories. If you cut out the wrong part of the brain, well, there go the piano lessons from when you were a child. So we see that there are specific regions of the brain that house specific memories. Also, everything we know, including the language we speak, comes into our sensory brain through the sensory input. So language, learning, self-identity, all is sensory input into a physical brain. So let's say that a man is 70 years old and he has never heard the sound of language. We just kept him alive and fed him and kept him hydrated. And he dies. Does he pop out into the hereafter speaking a language with his colleagues if he never learned a language? Our self-awareness is shaped by interactions with others, and the input of that interaction is input into a physical brain. Also, if only models of self-conscious aware beings are those with physical brains, and we are made in God's image, then based on the model of consciousness and brains we derive from our own experience as sentient thinking beings, how can we expect to believe in and to conceive of a mind without the attributes of a physical brain? How can God think? Well, Peter says, well, God is not like us. Well, he can't make that assertion. He has to prove it. So if even our memory can be destroyed by the destruction of certain aspects of the brain, then the people who believe in life after death are saying, destroy a quarter of my brain, you've destroyed a quarter of my memory, destroy 50% of my brain, you've destroyed 50% of my memory and self-awareness, but destroy 100% of my brain, that is, kill me, and my consciousness that was once housed in the brain pops out fully intact in some other environment. I mean, that certainly seems less likely than likely. And what Peter and I are engaged in tonight is a battle of probabilities. And I believe that I'm able to show that given the physical universe around us, it is more probable than not that there is nothing beyond nature. Now, let's talk about evil. God can make whatever he wants to happen. So why are there natural disasters, holocausts? If the suffering is a warning from God, he should explain what it is. Peter writes on page 5 of The Problem of Evil and Suffering, Gaining Perspective, that that if God is good, then nothing in his character would ever motivate him to do evil. Well, but then again, God contradicts Peter in Isaiah 45:7 by saying, I create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Why is one person born into poverty and someone else born into a mansion? My mother got no benefit from being in Auschwitz. It didn't improve her strength. It didn't make her more powerful. It didn't make her stronger. There was no benefit to that. So the burden of proof is on the theist to show that evil is not fatal to an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God. And even if we humans need discipline, we could use a military boot camp, but not a concentration camp. Let's take malaria, for instance. It's a terrible disease. There is a gene, though, that provides an effective defense against malaria. It works by destroying any red corpuscles that have been occupied by any of the types of parasitic protozoans that cause malaria. But if you inherit the gene from both parents that fights malaria, the result is you get sickle cell anemia. Why did God set it up this way? God does not adequately comfort the suffering. He's too harsh with us if he exists. The distribution of disease and pain is in no way related to the virtue of the afflicted. And it is the theist, not the naturalist, who must explain this. So also, how can God be all-knowing and unchanging with respect to his views on what is evil and what is not if he changes his mind and decides not to do evil that he had been planning to do? Exodus 32:14, and the Lord repented of the evil which he sought to do unto his people. Well, if God is omniscient, he knows all, and he knows that they would repent. So if he knows they would repent, how could he then, as he says in Jeremiah 18:8, I, God, will repent of the evil I thought to do unto them? How can God change his mind if he knew all along that he was going to change his mind? That really doesn't make sense. Also, what about the flourishing and languishing of us sentient beings? That is more explainable on naturalism than on theism. So we only have a few decades of good health and particularly physical vigor, and then the decline and illness of old age after a lifetime of hard work. Countless living organisms, including sentient beings, never flourish at all, and countless others flourish only briefly. And this would be extremely surprising given theism. but it is what one would expect in a world that is natural without a supernatural governor making things right. Now, on evolution, I admit that you can be a believer in a God and still believe in evolution. However, since this is the battle of probabilities, it is more likely than not that evolution, which is true on naturalism because it's so sloppy and it's so haphazard. More than 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. This is wasteful. We have useless components to our bodies, like the appendix. I mean, that's a very, very poor design. Evolution by natural selection is established by the weight of the evidence in our world. For instance, there's a 100% match of DNA sequence in the pseudogene region of beta globin is proof that humans and gorillas had a recent common ancestor. But to tie this all together, we have the argument of divine hiddenness. Why allow reasonable non-belief? Why play hide and seek with your own children? God did not comfort my paternal grandmother as the Nazis in Lithuania were about to shoot her into a pit that she was forced to dig. God did not comfort my maternal grandfather as he was about to be shoved into the gas chamber at Auschwitz. So why be so inaccessible except by ancient hearsay and by denying us moderns the right to see the same type of miracles? Why not be more directly communicative? As Thomas Jefferson wrote to his nephew Peter Carr, question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if he exists, he much prefer the homage of reason to that of blindfolded fear. So why are there so many religions? Why not a simulcast in every language of the world with some guidance? If a supernatural voice appeared right now, or I was levitated to the ceiling and I was told which church or which synagogue or which Buddhist temple to go to, I would be there. Do some kind of miracle. Have the San Diego Chargers win 5 Super Bowls in a row. Anything. Not only the ironclad predictable laws of nature that betray no actual evidence of the supernatural. There's every reason to believe all God concepts are fabricated by people and do not possess the independent truthfulness of objective reality. Now, why did God make it so hard for us to believe in him? On the argument from divine hiddenness, we have a right to expect that if there is a God, he would give us a revelation sufficient for non-belief to no longer be reasonable. If non-belief is reasonable, if Peter himself admits he can only make probabilistic arguments, then it's fundamentally unfair of God to say, okay, you didn't believe in the right religion, therefore you suffer forever. For instance, why such a hard-to-believe Bible? In the first chapter of Genesis, stars are created after the earth. Well, we know the earth came into existence at least 9 billion years after the universe came about, and you have to have stars before planets because they have to explode as a supernova in order for planets to form. Now, in Genesis, the stars are deemed to be a fixed firmament, which we know is not true. Modern cosmology says the galaxies of the stars are not fixed but receding from each other, which we see by the redshift as the measurement from the Big Bang of the way the stars recede. Now there's the argument from religious confusion, a subset of the argument from divine hiddenness. Many Christians disagree on many items of belief. Is baptism necessary or unnecessary? What is the role of good deeds in salvation, or does mere faith suffice alone? The Bible says contradictory things here. In some segments, it says mere faith in Jesus is sufficient for salvation. In others, it requires good deeds as a prerequisite for salvation. And what text of supposed revelation does God want us to believe? So here's the thing. Peter mentioned the Bible in his opening statement, finally. But even if he didn't, I'm epistemologically entitled to raise it as an issue to attack, because even if Peter tried to dodge his Bible, I have a right to say, wait a minute. If there is a God who wants us to know him, we have a reasonable expectation he would give us a reliable revelation. If that revelation is defective, it is a separate, independent argument against the existence of God. So, Are my ancestors, the Jews, still God's chosen people? Can a Jew be saved without accepting Jesus? Why does God believe the sincere Jew to disbelieve in the ultimate messiahhood of Jesus? My father was a sincere Orthodox rabbi. He studied Christianity and rejected it. Is he now burning in hell? The Dalai Lama and his followers meditate with intense earnestness many hours a day and come away not with the Christian God, but with some universal force. Why is there this confusion if there is one specific revelation? Why do the yogis of India and the Buddhist monks of Thailand get a different sensation from their meditative practices and feel some kind of cosmic mush that loves everybody? So we would have a right to reasonable revelation that would be given to us with sufficient certainty so that disbelief in the proper religion would not be reasonable. The absence of guidance is not what you would expect if there is a God. The absence of guidance is what you would expect if there is not a God. Now, there is the argument from scale. Scientists currently believe that 96% of the universe is either dark matter or dark energy, meaning that a scant 4%, if even that, of the universe is even conceptually accessible by us. Of that 4%, virtually all of it is comprised of empty space, and some 2 degrees above absolute zero, which is, of course, instantly lethal to living things. So essentially, the universe is almost entirely off limits to humanity, and of that part which is not off limits, almost all of that is trying to kill us. Now consider that our galaxy contains at least 200 billion stars and accompanying solar systems, all of which are inaccessible to us. Our galaxy, in turn, is one of more than 100 billion galaxies in the observable universe. And that means that there are also trillions and trillions of planets, with 99.999, I could 99 all night long, in the universe. Why would God need all of these trillions of excess debris planets if we are at the core of his creation and concern? Now, again, Peter cannot keep switching back between his vague, maybe not all-powerful God and the biblical God, because then I can hang him on what he has written in his online article, that apart from the special revelation of himself in the Bible, little can be confidently known of God, including his goodness, so Peter can't have it both ways. I'm sorry, but I take him to the bakery and I can't let him have his cake and eat it too. So if you have trillions and trillions of planets, we say, gee, God, just for us? The universe is around 14 billion years old. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. We humans have been around maybe for the most 150,000 years. So for most of the 14 billion, more than 99.99, here we go again, infinite nines, well not infinite, but a lot. We haven't even been here, and we are the epicenter of the concern of the Creator. And again, we say, gee, God, all this just for us? It doesn't make as much sense as naturalism. Now, Peter mentioned the supposed fine-tuning of the universe, but that's not so clear that everything has to be this fine-tuned, because look at it this way. If God is omnipotent, the fine-tuning argument becomes vacuous, because God could make us live even in a vacuum. If the fine-tuning argument is supposed to show an omnipotent, all-powerful God, not the retreat God that Peter tried to sort of tentatively begin with in his opening statement, if you have that kind of God, he could make us live in anything. Why does he have to do all the tinkering? Because he doesn't need to. Being omnipotent, he could have us live in water. So that itself from the outset, and I'll say more about that on rebuttal, is really an unnecessary accretion if we're speaking about an omnipotent being. So therefore, Peter has an enormous burden. He has to show something that I don't have to show. I begin by saying, folks, we have the natural. It's all around us. Peter has to show that there is something magical underlying the natural, for which there is really no good evidence, so it's much more likely than not that there is no God. Thank you.
Okay, I know it's hard to hold your applause, but let's keep the rest of the applause for the end, if you would, please. Thank you. Now, each speaker has a 10-minute rebuttal time. Speaker number one.
Eddie fundamentally misunderstands the relationship of evidence for a generic God and evidence for a specific God, namely the God of the Bible. The reason why the background evidence is important is that it makes more plausible the idea that something like God might exist. If in fact there's some non-material being that created the world, that regardless of whether or not it's all-powerful, all-knowing, that gives us some reason for thinking that mind might be able to exist without being embodied. I talked about the next thought after I die will be an embodied thought. But the reason why I appeal to these general arguments is that they're important for putting a backdrop within which the Christian claims can make sense. If one doesn't have any reason to believe that God exists at all, and one says, well, maybe he had to reveal himself to us in a perfectly clear and reliable revelation. Well, why should I believe that if there's not some reason for believing that something exists that could reveal itself to us? So the general arguments provide the background plausibility. It's not my cheating in saying that I'm leaving the beliefs I have. The comment I made about Revelation doesn't tell, apart from Revelation, we don't find out very much about God as a relation of God's goodness. If you consider the argument from fine-tuning or the origin of the universe or the fact that we're conscious, we don't know from that God cares about us. It doesn't get us to the God of the Bible. If you have all these reasons to believe there's some cosmic mind that doesn't tell you ought to trust yourself to it, is very different than the foundation for an actual faith that makes a difference in our lives where we can trust God. But to believe that there is a powerful being and the various reasons to point in that direction are important in lending credibility to the more specific claims that I would have as a Christian. He talks about probabilities and needing to prove. So for instance, he says, I haven't proven that there is a mind behind the universe. The fact of the matter is that apart from mathematics, you never have proof in a strong sense. In fact, there is no inductive logic or logic that tells you how you should weigh evidence. Even when you agree that certain line of evidence points in one direction or another, there's no objective way of saying how you ought to weigh it. So when he says talk about the weight of the evidence, he's really saying go with your considered judgment. Go with what seems right to you. Now he says, surely if God exists at all, then he must reveal himself clearly to us. That doesn't make sense to me. The background reasons for believing something like God stand regardless of whether he's given a clear revelation to us. And there's nothing to think that when God reveals himself to us that he's going to reveal himself to us in a way which is perfect in every regard. He seems to think that God has dictated himself to us when you read Scripture. So for instance, when you read about the firmament and the stars, or in Genesis, the creation of the sun being mentioned after the creation of the plants, say. The Bible, God doesn't, in fact, dictate to us, and there's no reason to think that God should download modern science into the minds of the prophets. When God wants to deliver his message, why should he sort of erase everything they believe and say, no, that's not right, so don't say anything. What he does is he works through them to communicate his message. You've asked, what was the message in Genesis? The message in Genesis was clearly understood by people at that time to be in stark contrast to the Babylonian creation myth. So one has to understand the Bible within context. When he said he reads the quote that God formed evil, God created evil. That's the King James version. Almost every other version says disaster, because the Hebrew word doesn't imply moral evil. It's God brings good and God brings disaster. Can God bring disaster? Yes, he can. So therefore, God is not contradictory in himself. He says that the Bible clearly teaches salvation by faith, and elsewhere it clearly teaches salvation by works. If you've read any commentaries about James and Paul, no, they're not in conflict with one another. There's a perfectly good explanation that they're writing different audiences where different things needed to be emphasized. For Paul, salvation is by faith, but genuine faith will always manifest itself. So if there's no manifestation of that, you're kidding yourself. James is writing in a context within which people thought you didn't have to behave morally at all. So he said, if you claim to have faith and don't have works, your faith is dead. It's different contexts and different points that are being made, and when you have this wooden literalism and fail to take the Bible seriously, you end up with these contradictions and conflicts. Now let me jump to the question of the problem of evil and the problem of hiddenness. I think that although there are explanations which should be given in terms of God wants to teach us moral character, that's is important. We ask, why did God create a world like this? Is this a good world for developing moral character? Yes, it is. But does that explain it? Why is it that apart from things like cancer that are behavior-related, like lung cancer that are behavior-related, why is it that Christians get cancer the same rates as everybody else? Is it because somehow we need to learn a lesson from that? No, so what's going on here? I would suggest that when you look to the Bible, the explanation lies in fact, God's justice. When I talk about why does God do what he does, justice almost never enters into it. But if you look at the significance of the cross theologically, justice is crucially important. Even though God's omnipotent, he could just say, I forgive them. The Bible teaches the reason Christ had to die on the cross was so that justice would be met, and at the same time, mercy extended to us. So justice is very important to the character of God. Now here I go beyond what Scripture actually teaches, but it's something which accords with the Scripture, it doesn't conflict with it. And that's the notion that when God gave us moral freedom, part of the just consequence of that is that we in general need to live with the consequence of what we do. God is not going to jump in and ameliorate the situation so the maximum goods come out from it. When God gives human parents the ability to be good parents or bad parents, he doesn't jump in and say, okay, you're going to do something that's going to harm this child for the rest of their life, so I won't let you do that. No, I think it's God's justice in giving us moral freedom, that part of the justice of that is that in general we need to live with the consequence of that. I don't think that's always the case, but when God does intervene, there have to be special reasons. So I'm suggesting that the reason why Hitler allowed the killing of 6 million Jews, including relatives of Eddie's family, was not because there's some greater good that comes out from it, but because God has given us moral responsibility. And what comes with that is the living with the consequences of it. What about the problem of natural evil, calamities like earthquakes, tsunamis? The Bible tells us that when we rebelled against God, we were separated in personal relationship with God. But I would suggest in addition to being separated from personal relationship with God, which also involves knowledge of God, we're also separated from God's protection. So when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, not only did they lose the personal relationship with God, they lost the protection. So I said all of us live with the consequence of living in a dangerous world. And it's because of the separation from God and the separation from protection that things like malaria and other things like that exist. He talks about why should we think evolution is something that God would design. Well, actually, I think evolution is a process. It doesn't actually explain everything. But evolution is a process that's quite elegant. God created an elegant universe. Why shouldn't he build into the universe a world which is adaptable, where creatures can adapt to changes, that they can change over time? If God would have to jump in every time some change was needed and do a miracle, that would be a bit strange. It makes perfectly good sense to me that God would create a world by laws of nature. He would create us in a vacuum. Isn't it reasonable if you were an all-powerful creator that you would create a world that lives by laws that you institute rather than having to do everything miraculously? No. So God creates a world which can adjust. He says it's a great waste to have such a huge volume of space with so little life. Why consider it waste? It's not a waste for God. So what if 99% of species that have ever lived no longer exist? If the species that existed never went extinct, you'd be impoverished in terms of the number of species which are around. And is death intrinsically an evil? I saw this thing that talks about death coming into the world through the rebellion of Adam and Eve against God. That was death in general, but it never says that. It talks about human death. In fact, they have to get animal skins to cover themselves after the rebellion. It seems as though death was already there. What would it even mean? No, by saying there's death. So the question is there any intrinsic evil in plant and animal death? Maybe God could create a world within which that's not part of it. But for me to say, oh, surely you could create a natural world where that's not a part of it, it's not all clear to me that's the case. Plus, most creatures for most of their lives do not languish. They do not live in suffering. Most of them live until something goes wrong and then they die quite quickly. Suffering is usually quite short. That they should die, why should we consider that to be intrinsic evil? Now, God, in fact, desired for us to be able to live, but we would die just like everything else if it weren't for God doing special things to give us life after death. So it's not because God has to make death be non-existent, but rather God has provided a way within which we can be reconciled in relationship with him. And the life eternal which God intended for Adam and Eve, which they lost because they rebelled against God, is something that we can have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now 10 minutes for Eddie.
Well, you see, Peter starts trying to have it both ways. He talks about a God of general revelation, But on footnote 2 of his article on suffering and evil online, he writes that apart from the special revelation of himself in the Bible, little can be confidently known of God. Well, he can't have written that and then, for purposes of tonight's debate, try to throw off the dross of the specifically Christian God so he has a lesser and easier God to defend. That doesn't work unless Peter is willing to back away from what he wrote in that footnote. Also, please note that Peter, who is a devout Christian, probably has just admitted that the King James Version of the Bible is wrong and has been wrong all these years because he said that future versions don't use the word evil, which he prefers. So it's kind of interesting, this kind of retrenchment. However, I will say this. I agree with Peter. I agree with him that if there's a God at all, it is more likely a generic God of universal love than a specific God that sends us to hell forever for not believing in Jesus. Now, Peter just talked about, when he lapsed back into the Christian theology, about Adam and Eve. Well, Adam and Eve is not plausible because, first of all, we know that humans evolved from prior, more primitive forms and that we and apes had a common ancestor. So a fully formed Adam and Eve is simply a fairy tale. Now, speaking of evolution, Peter says it's elegant. Well, it's not that elegant so as to show a divine hand. Peter asked, well, why is it wrong that 99% of the species existed? It's not wasteful. Well, yes, it is, because if evolution were in fact divinely guided, why didn't God just bring about spontaneously, as some of the more fundamentalists argue, this very current creatures that he wants? Why go through all of this trial and error? The way evolution gropes, the way it makes mistakes, the way it leaves useless appendages shows it's more of a blind trial and error force. The same thing with the argument from Scale. Peter, who believes that we humans are the central concern of his God, as opposed to the more generic God in which he really doesn't believe because he believes in the Christian God. But nevertheless, why all this debris? It is debris. Trillions and trillions of planets, if we are at the center, a universe which is primarily lethal to us. And look at the similarities here. On a cosmic and on a biological level, a wasteful universe with so much debris, a wasteful evolution with so many dead ends and extinct species, both are more likely on the naturalistic than on the supernatural alternative. Now, as far as the fine-tuning argument is concerned, Peter has to show that there couldn't be life with different constants. Peter has to show that there couldn't be other forms of life, like silicon. If this is the only universe we have, then it's meaningless to say, yes, but it's so rare for a life-affirming universe because this is the only one we have. If there are multiverses, then that also cuts against Peter's argument, because if there are billions and billions of universes, then it's more likely that among all of them, one with our constants would arise. So either way, on either theory, the natural explanation still makes more sense. He talked about Occam's razor and even admitted that at first blush, it's more likely that there would be naturalism and theism because naturalism is simpler. But he is admitting too much in that because his theistic accretion is an unnecessary addition. He hasn't yet demonstrated cosmic mind. Now, he talked about the Big Bang. Well, either way, the Big Bang is more likely on naturalism than on theism because, first of all, on theism, he has to demonstrate how an incorporeal mind, a mind that operates without a physical brain for which we have absolutely no evidence outside of space and time, could jumpstart space and time. If the universe always existed, then we can have the infinite regress, which the theists don't like, but which they claim their God always existed. There's a bit of a contradiction there. And if time and space did begin with the Big Bang, then you can't even, under current understanding, speak of a cause, because cause and effect have to play out in the context of time and space. And without time and space, you can't cause B. So to say that there was a cause of the universe actually doesn't make it, under current theories of the Big Bang either way. Either there's an infinite regress, which theists don't like except when it's their God, or time and space began with the Big Bang, which means that there couldn't be any cause of it, as we commonly use the term cause, because time and space didn't come about by the Big Bang. So either way, it doesn't work. Now, he talked about the justice of God as a response to the argument from evil. But that doesn't quite do it, because if we are dealing with an omnipotent God, and Peter hasn't yet fully conceded that he's defending a non-omnipotent God, maybe he's going to become a deist and will be the Thomas Jefferson of the 21st century, but he hasn't yet admitted that. If we're dealing with an omnipotent God, God has a terrible problem, because if God is all-powerful, he has to show that the evil that he allows to happen or causes to happen either is so necessary that he couldn't have prevented a greater evil, which is a very, very hard showing for a God who's otherwise omnipotent, or he has to show with his unlimited power he was not able to bring about an even greater good, which he could only bring about by allowing the horrendous evil in question. That's a very high hurdle for an omnipotent being. And when Peter says, essentially, God doesn't have to explain himself to us, well, that really departs from the kind of reasonable argument that we need to have, because if, in fact, there is a God who wants us to know him, then we have a right to expect that he would give us evidence sufficient for our minds to know him, because he knows our mind and made our minds. And if he can't even do that, then it's far more likely than not that he does not exist, because if he did exist, there would be more direct evidence. Now, again, when Peter talks about the fall, he is talking about Adam and Eve, which is not really plausible on evolution. And if he talks about the fall, he's talking about something that upset God and the angels. Well, if moral freedom is so good, if free will is so wonderful as Peter claims it is, how come the angels don't have free will? And if they do have free will, why can't we have the same kind of angelic free will? Also, why is free will such a great virtue in the first place? I wouldn't let a 3-year-old child push another 3-year-old child off a cliff just so it can manifest free will. God, if he exists, had the ability to make us morally better and still give us free will. And here's the proof. There are many people on this planet who are much more wonderful than other people, yet they still have free will. The very nice people on this planet don't have less free will than the very terrible people on this planet. Why couldn't God have made more of them? And also, if moral freedom is so great, why doesn't God have it? If God is incapable of doing a moral wrong, then God is unfree. So if God doesn't have if moral freedom is defined as the ability to do wrong, and then God doesn't have moral freedom, and God doesn't have free will, and if the response is, well, God is perfect, that's a presupposition that needs to be proven. Now, very important with respect to fine-tuning. It's not that close, because first of all, we know from a study by Steven Weinberg that the carbon, the 7.65 million electron volts energy of the radioactive state of carbon above its normal state is not really that essential, as is the 0.25 million electronic energy volts of the radioactive state, which is an unstable composite of a beryllium-8 nucleus and a helium nucleus, and all this gives a margin of error of about 20%, which is not that close a call. So even then, we have a conflict between the fine-tuning argument and the design argument. If the universe were so perfectly designed, how come it hangs on such a precipice that even if you vary one little thing, it'll fall apart? Again, this is a debate not on absolute certainty, but on probability. And the overwhelming weight of the evidence in the universe makes it more likely than not that the universe is natural and not supernatural, because otherwise we'd see evidence of the supernatural. It's more likely than not that there is no God.
Okay, thank you for your attention. Now we have 2 rounds of cross-examination. Peter will ask a 1-minute question. Eddie will have 2 minutes to respond. And we'll alternate that for the first round, and then there'll be another round where Eddie will get to ask a question for 1 minute, and Peter will respond. So, Peter, you have the first question.
Yeah, why is it, Eddie, that when you say that if God exists, he must reveal himself in a perfect way? It sounds as though that doesn't relate at all to the general arguments about the character of God. If you don't get rid of those general arguments, then all your arguments against the supernatural seem to be rather vacuous. You're really only attacking the God of the Bible, whereas my argument was that there's no reason, if God exists, period, to think that he would reveal himself in this way, nor with the precision that you think the writers of the Bible should have had, which I don't think is involved in the notion of divine inspiration. So why is it that you think that you can so easily dismiss the general arguments for the existence of God? You've said very, very little about that.
Well, I don't think that I've dismissed them, because I've gone heavily into the argument from physical minds. I've gone heavily into the fine-tuning argument. I've gone heavily into evolution. I've gone heavily into all the arguments that deal with the supernatural generically. And I guess the reason why, Peter, is I simply pay too much attention to what you write when you say that apart from the special revelation of himself in the Bible, little can be confidently known about God. I mean, you can't have it both ways. If you are defending a generic supernatural entity, then what you're defending tonight is you're saying, Eddie says there's a God that doesn't say that there's a God that exists that doesn't care about us. I say there is a God that exists that doesn't care about us. You are unnaturally retreating into a deism which you yourself don't believe, and for that there isn't even any God. But that doesn't even matter, because look what you did. In your statements, you began all of a sudden talking about specifically the God of the Bible. So you're doing both things. You're bringing up the generic God, and then you're defending the specifically Christian God. So I have a right to attack each of the gods you're bringing up and to ask you, Peter, will your real God stand up? Is it generic or Christian?
Okay, thank you. Peter, you have another 1-minute question.
Yeah, when it comes to the question of ethics, it seems to me that the physical world is all that exists. Then the only values that can possibly exist are things that people happen to value. Now, there are a few things that people value because they're biologically wired into us, such as parents caring for their children. But even there's nothing wired into us that says you ought to always care for your children. So from a standpoint of naturalism, you once said before that you thought that we were able to intuit right and wrong like you could mathematical principles. Do you still hold to that, or do you think that really all you can get from reason is a bare minimum of some human tendencies, but never even an obligation that we have to adhere to those tendencies rather than the countervailing ones which support aggression, etc.?
Well, Peter, you see, first of all I have to do is to show that naturalistic morality is more plausible than theistic morality. Now, again, depending on which God you choose to defend, if you're talking about the specific revelation of the Bible, you've got a very horrible, evil, atrocity-committing God to defend. If you're not talking about that God, but you're talking about a generic God, you have the burden of proof of showing where he has written his laws. If he has not written his laws in the Bible, did he write them in our hearts? If he's written them in our hearts, then how come many of us feel moral compunction against what's in the Bible, the atrocities, the anti-women, the anti-gay, the pro-slavery, all of that? So all I have to do is to show, not with absolute certainty, but to show that inherent in our evolving nature, we are improving our morality, and the further away we get from religion, the more moral we become. The further we get away from forcing women into subordination, the further we get away from putting gays to death, the further we get away from all the strict biblical code. And you can't, as a Christian, say, well, no, that's not our law, because Jesus said, not what jot or tittle of the law shall change. So all I have to do is to show that by natural assessment, we can come to a morality that is more benevolent than that which is derived from the Bible, unless you yourself are willing to give up the Bible and admit that it is a defective location for the derivation of objective moral values.
Peter, you have another question, and then we'll switch.
Yeah, the question has to do with this sort of this horrible God, and the Christian ethics is terrible. Actually, if you ask where is it that humanistic values came from, historically, it came from people who wanted to maintain Christian values but just get God out of the picture. So humanistic values really derived from the Bible and the teachings of Jesus. And yet what you want to do is you want to take some instances of things God did in the Old Testament that you think are too severe, that he shouldn't have wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah, he shouldn't have wiped out the Canaanites because of their moral corruption. And therefore God must be this horrible thing, whereas in fact the trend throughout Scripture is that God really does care for us. Why is it that you ignore the teachings of Jesus and the overall trend and say the God of the Bible has this horrible ethics, when in fact people who know the Bible, even secular people, say, what is biblical ethics? They would say, well, there are these problems, but overall Christians have values that deeply undergird humanistic values, and that's where those values came from to a very large extent.
Well, Peter, you don't even have to ask me. Ask Thomas Jefferson. What he did was he took a Bible and he divested it of all supernatural trappings. And he called Jesus a most excellent moral teacher, but stripped away of all the damnation, the fire and brimstone, and the hell. But even that, you have a problem here, because basic ethics, do unto others, you'd have them do unto you, Confucius, even some things in the Old Testament, though it's filled with atrocities, these are something that you don't need Christians to have discovered. And I'll go so far as to say, even if Christians discovered something first, that doesn't mean it's supernatural. Your question is like the Orthodox rabbi who once said to me, Eddie, how can you have abandoned our faith? We Jews invented washing our hands before eating, so we must have the right religion. Well, that doesn't prove anything. Let's say that it was a Christian who opened the first charity hospital. That doesn't make Christianity metaphysically correct. And also, the Catholic Church has more hospitals than you Protestants, but I don't see you as an evangelical Protestant converting to Catholicism. So it doesn't matter who got there first. It matters whether ethics can be grounded in natural experience, and human experience shows that. Because otherwise, if we have a transcendental foundation for ethics, it means we can't improve on it. We have to say, wait a minute, God said it, end of argument. That means we can't use our modern intellect and evolving sense of justice to improve social justice on the planet. And experience itself shows that's not true.
Okay, thank you. And now Eddie has an opportunity to ask 3 questions. The first one.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to try to tie you to what I think you've been trying to do, and I've been trying to do, which is an evidential argument. Now, in his book, Reasonable Faith, a colleague of yours, William Lane Craig, in reference to God's requirement that people believe in him, says that people are required to believe even if, and I quote, they are given no good reason to believe and many persuasive reasons to disbelieve. Do you fully agree with Dr. Craig on this? And if not, how does your position differ?
Okay, my position differs in that I'm more of an evidentialist in that regard than Bill Craig is. But what Bill Craig is getting at is a debate in epistemology between what's called internalism and externalism. So what constitutes reasonable belief? The internalist says you only have reasonable belief if you can give reasons for it. The problem with that is that no animal ever has reasonable belief because they can't give reasons for it. The externalist says, no, what you believe is actually a result of the input, outputs, or the interaction you have with the world around you. And if you have the right connection with the world outside of you, and that gives rise to the belief, and that's why you have the belief, then it is a reasonable belief even if you can't give reasons for it. Now, it's atheists as well as Christians who take both sides of this, so it's not clear how it comes out. But Bill Craig is taking the Alva Planting approach that says, no, it's an externalist view of knowledge. So if in fact God does exist, and he causes me to come to believe that he exists and have this sense of relating to him, then if that is the case, then it's at least possible that I know on an externalist account that God exists. But you can't really know that you know. That's the problem that I have with the Bill Craig argument. But his point is that you can have reason that the mind does not know of, that if in fact you have the right connections, you can genuinely know even when you can't give reasons. Now, that doesn't help a whole lot unless you have this conviction that, well, it certainly seems to me that God has spoken to me, and my own experiences aren't so dramatic that I can say, well, I just believe it's not psychological because, after all, it just seems to me to be real. But for Christians who have had those experiences and people who have, you have to say, look, they have had very dramatic experiences. If you had that kind of dramatic experiences, you say, well, no, it can't possibly be. So I had a friend who was an atheist who had a dramatic religious experience and decided God must exist. He's not a Christian yet, but why should he put that weight in the experience? Because he believes that it came from something outside of himself, and that's not an irrational position given contemporary epistemology. Thank you.
Okay.
Eddie, your second question.
Okay. Well, you yourself have made reference to the Bible, Peter, so it is in play. Now, no one's ever heard any of you evangelical Christians say that the Old Testament is now to be severed from the totality of what we call the Bible. So how can you justify God's ordering all the innocent children and babies to be slaughtered, as is the case in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3, and all the rape as spoils of war that God orders in Deuteronomy 21, 10, 14, and Numbers 13, 17 through 18?
Okay. When it comes to the question, why could God wipe out the whole community? We tend to be very individualists and think that, no, God would never judge a community. He can only judge individuals. But in fact, part of the fabric of moral responsibility is that we do suffer from what other people do. Children do suffer from what their parents do. When God brings judgment, it's not just on individuals, but on communities, and communities are going to involve the whole community. And I might say, well, God should never kill anybody. Well, God is God, and we are not. So if we shouldn't play God. That means we don't have life and death in our own hands. That's true. But if, in fact, our rebellion against God means our own death, and I think God being the source of light is going to mean that, to say God couldn't possibly exist if, in fact, he gives capital punishment for people who are deeply immoral. The Canaanites were earlier in Genesis said God's waiting until their sins mount up to a high enough level that he's going to actually bring judgment. Now, you may not like that, but not liking that doesn't mean that the death penalty from God's hand is never justified. When it comes to the other question about why believe that the Old Testament commands don't apply to us today, or many of them don't, one needs to recognize that if God were to give the ideal laws in the Old Testament, given that people have free will, they would have simply ignored them if they're radically different from their culture. What you have is you have a progression in which God is giving laws which are significantly better and moves in the right direction in the Old Testament, and there are the hints and suggestions there for their eventual overthrow. So even slavery is something which is curtailed such that you cannot beat a person, a slave. If you injure them permanently, they must be released. You should harbor, not return runaway slaves, because the assumption that they are mistreated. The principle is you were slaves, so therefore you need to have compassion on other people. So there are things in the Old Testament which are not the ideal, but clearly in the Old Testament you have what builds to Jesus saying that it was because of their hardness of heart that some of these laws were given, and not because the law as itself stands as ideal.
Okay. My third question.
And yes, your third
Okay.
question before we open it to the audience.
Okay. Peter, I'm going to admit, since this is an evidential argument, that my atheism could be falsified. If my dead father walked in here right now in his inimitable Yiddish accent and said, Eddie, why are you debating with the Christian? Why aren't you in your office working? Believe me, I would change my worldview. If we were levitated to the ceiling right now, I'd say, oh boy, I better reconsider things. I'm willing to say that my atheism is falsifiable. What would falsify your theism?
Asking what would falsify it, at what point would I give it up? Certainly there would be a point in which I would give it up. So for instance, the problem of evil and suffering does weigh for me. It's not as though it doesn't weigh for something. There are things, I don't know where it would come, but there's some point in which I would give it up. And you're saying your atheism is falsifiable. Suppose your father were to come back here and appear. Would that really prove that God exists? Why not simply say that, kind of like in the movie Contact, you had aliens appearing in the form of her father? Why believe that it's God? Why not believe this is an alien? In fact, earlier on you said that anything is more probable than a miracle can occur. But here, if that happened, you would say, well, it can't be a miracle because after all, anything, even aliens, is more probable. So what you've done is you've placed miracles in the category of being better than any other possible explanation, but you can only do that because you assume that if you accept miracles, you're negating the laws of nature, whereas in fact, take serious the notion of miracles is in fact to say there can be something beyond this world. So it's not as though it negates the laws of nature, and to say that all atheistic or all naturalistic arguments must win is simply to say that by definition, miracles can't happen. In fact, he at one point says that it fights against itself, that the laws of nature fight against themselves, but if you believe that miracles happen. But no, it's not. It's saying there's something beyond it. If a person believes in laws of nature, they can still entertain the possibility of something beyond that. To believe that miracles might happen is to believe laws of nature are laws of nature. They're not laws of everything. So therefore, it is not just a lunacy to believe that you could have a good reason for believing that a miracle happened. I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you. Each questioner shall have not more than 1 minute to frame a question, and the debater to whom the question is addressed shall answer first, then the opponent shall answer, and each debater will have 2 minutes to respond to each question, regardless of to whom the question is addressed. And then just as a reminder, after the 30 minutes for the question and answer, each debater will have a 12-minute closing statement, and then we will be adjourned.
I invite both debaters to address the question, but I direct it specifically to Dr. Payne. Dr. Payne, my background also includes multiple degrees and having worked at places like the White House Science Office. In addition to having been born into a Catholic family, and at age 13 in confirmation class, I declined to draw a picture of God the Holy Father as directed by a Catholic nun. I suffered all kinds of consequences for that because I declined to draw God the Holy Father as all the other children were doing. And I wrote at the bottom of the page in my 13-year-old handwriting, "I do not know what God looks like, do you, ? So I ask you to answer the question the nun and the priest couldn't, who threw me out of confirmation class and bid that I come back a year later when I would be more compliant. I direct that as a question, the compliance, because frankly I find this belief in the Christian, Islamic, and Hebraic God nothing but conformity and induced fear, starting on 3-year-olds and 7-year-olds, such as the Catholic tradition. Please address that and indicate this is not merely fostering continuation of a delusion that serves the needs both financial and psychological of people like yourself. And second question is, do you agree that we must keep church and state?
Why don't we just stick to one question, okay? 2 minutes?
Okay,
Right,
well, then I would ask also if he cares to direct, should we keep religion and church and state separate in our government for all reasons of wisdom?
2 minutes over here.
Okay, two problems with what was done with you. One is that it's biblically unsound. After all, if God is non-material, he doesn't look like anything. He can choose to appear to us in various ways we want to, so they were wrong on that. Plus, they were also wrong on punishing you for not believing exactly that. Now, it is true that if you're going through a catechism, and there are certain things that one believes as a Catholic, and the question is, do you want to become a member of this church, then yeah, you do have to agree with it. But drawing a picture and saying you're bad because you didn't draw a picture, that kind of abuse simply ought not to occur. Separation of church and state, there's been separation of church and state from Christianity at the beginning, which wasn't true, say, of Islam. In fact, we are to obey the rulers. Jesus said, give to God what the things of God, give to Caesar the things which are Caesar. That doesn't mean that Christian principles shouldn't enter into decision-making that Christians have, or the values that we have come from a variety of different roots. But what it does mean is we need to recognize that we live in a pluralist society, and we need to honor and respect one another, and that will mean respecting other people's position and allowing them to say what they say even when we disagree strongly.
Okay. Eddie, you have 2 minutes to respond.
Yes. Well, you see, the question going to the nature of God, again, I can't let Peter escape his own writings. I don't mean to cause Peter pain, but when he writes that apart from the special revelation of himself in the Bible, little can be confidently known of God, and yet for purposes of tonight's debate, he tries to say, well, I'm just speaking about a generic God who can't even be all-powerful. If he admits that little can be confidently known of God, then he admits that if he doesn't cling to his special revelation, he's not able to make the case for any God because little can be known of him. And that's the problem. However, I must say that I am very gratified at his concession that a generic God is more likely than the Christian God he believes in, because the Christian God he believes in is an atrocious creature who punishes us forever just for not picking the right religion. But the question is, does any supernatural mind exist? How does it work? For instance, O.J. Simpson was going to outrage society by writing a book saying, I didn't do it, but if I did, here's how I did those killings. Well, we need God to do that. How I did it. He has to demonstrate how these things happened, and then I would believe. Then I could say, God, you little devil, pardon the pun, clever, clever. So that's how you did it. Okay, Peter, take me to church. But you see, we don't have any demonstration of the mechanism by which an incorporeal supernatural being, be he generic or specific, impacted or acted upon matter and energy. And that is what Peter needs to prove.
That was going much beyond the
Okay,
question.
thank you. We have a question over here.
Okay, this is for Eddie. Hi, I'm curious to know what sort of naturalism you subscribe to. I'm an artificial intelligence researcher and I study human rationalization mechanisms. It is indeed the case that two people with two opposing belief systems can live equally rational lives. They simply differ in their axioms. So one type of naturalist is almost functionally equivalent to like a rational supernaturalist. And the other type I find a bit myopic and maybe irrationally radical. I want everyone, so this is what I want to know. I want everyone in here, I'm going out on a limb, who knows they've experienced a miracle to stand up or to raise their hand. Okay, so clearly there's non-zero evidence for what may be allegedly miraculous. How many instances of medically supportable faith healings does it take before one becomes irrational to not consider that prayer heals? The evidence is all around you, whether attributed to the natural or supernatural. So then you are either functionally no different than the people standing, or you are maybe being myopic. I'm curious as to how you would reconcile that.
Okay, well, first of all, if you'll permit me, I don't have to bind myself to the bipolar categories you gave. I'm going to just say I'm an evidentialist. Now, you talked about prayer and faith healing studies, and if you look at the book God, the Failed Hypothesis by Victor Stenger, the studies actually show that prayer did not work to heal the sick. I mean, bring me evidence. Bring me evidence that's not anecdotal. And this goes to Peter's claim of incorporeal minds. If, for instance, Peter would go into the other room right now, and I would write something on this piece of paper, and he would project himself and tell me what I wrote down, then I would start to say, okay, let's have a different kind of discussion. But it's impossible for him to do that. Now, Peter accused me of saying that miracles can't happen by definition. No, I'm not doing that. I'm making a probabilistic argument that the antecedent probability based on human experience makes it far more likely than not that it didn't occur. Now, if people believe they happened to them, let's show objective evidence. If somebody would levitate over here, I would say, okay, something is going on that's at least paranormal. But you see, that's not even going to happen. If I leave my body tonight and I float around and see things I couldn't have possibly known and it's verified, that's a different story. So the question is there a solid evidentiary basis for saying that miraculous events which violate the laws of nature occur? And I will say, at a minimum, not yet.
You have 2 minutes if you want them.
Yeah, by a solid basis, he's assuming that the only solid basis you can have would be something that can be proven. He's saying that if God doesn't do really dramatic things because Eddie wants to have us levitate or be transported to Hawaii, as he said before, but it's not obvious to me that God is the kind of God who does tricks for us. When the people who were opposed to Jesus said, show us a miracle, it wasn't that Jesus hadn't already done plenty, but it wasn't done before them. They only had hearsay about these healings having taken place. Now, when healing takes place today, do we know that there is no naturalistic explanation? No, we don't. One quick example, I was talking to a surgeon this last Sunday who had a patient who came in for surgery, and he had a tangerine-sized growth in the line of his lining of his stomach. And he said, let me pray for you. And he prayed and said, Lord, help this either to be benign or simply to disappear. A week later, he came in for a CAT scan and it was completely gone. Now, we know that that happened. Is there a naturalistic? There might be a naturalistic explanation. That happens a lot. Should we simply dismiss all those because we say, well, God has to do something more dramatic? It seems to me that to insist that God has to do something more dramatic is to say God has to jump through hoops for us. And I think actually that God's separation from us, as I said before, an explanation for why God doesn't show himself as much to us is due to that separation from God. In fact, God lets things run to a large extent because of the break in relationship we have, not a protective relationship, but God also doesn't show himself to us in really obvious ways. One last thing, if God were to make himself obvious to us, what result would that have on our moral behavior? It's like if you're driving your car and you know there's a policeman there and the radar is pointing at you, yes, you will behave. But is that learning moral responsibility? No. If you know that God's always there and he's going to zap you, if you know that absolute certainty, no, people will in fact obey, but it's not the kind of trust in God that God really wants to give us, wants us to have.
Okay, a question from over here, please.
Yes, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Eddie. My question is this: I'm somewhat bemused, disappointed, and amused that so much of the underlying debate is biblically centered. And I'm wondering how you take into account the work of the scholars from the Jesus Seminar. And I would really argue with the question of we only know about God as he has revealed himself through the Bible. The Bible is a work of fiction, and historical documents that have been found in fairly recent years do confirm that there are many other forms of texts about what Jesus said or did not say, and so I find it very unreliable.
Yeah, it gives me a response to respond to something that Eddie has said several times. When I said that there's not a whole lot that we can know about God apart from what God has revealed to us, my opinion of, say, the argument for design, or I did my dissertation on fine-tuning, it seems to me you have plausible arguments, and it may be there's a significant chance that there's something immaterial behind it all. There's a good case to be made for it. But all I have is a good case. I don't have anything to really hang my hat on. I said earlier that when I said that doesn't give us very much, I'm talking about the goodness of God. From the general arguments, we don't believe that God cares that much for us, and that is what my faith really depends on so much. And if God hasn't revealed himself in some way, then we can't even know in terms of other character of God very much about God. So it's not as though I'm jumping ship. No, the general arguments are arguments that provide background for my belief, and it's not as though I have to choose between those two guys. When it comes to the question of what about the Bible, the Jesus Seminar has as a principle, almost everyone in it, as a principle, if a miracle happened, then Jesus couldn't have said it, because after all, miracles don't happen. Well, that means there's an awful lot of the New Testament that simply gets excluded from that. And they end up having the principle that Jesus didn't say something if the rabbis before had said it. And they don't accept it as coming from Jesus if the early church taught it. So you have a minimal definition of what Jesus taught. Now that may have you have the strongest certitude for that, but to say that we can only therefore believe 10% of what Jesus has said actually appeals to it. When it comes to the other things like the Gnostic Gospels, there was one on TV about the Gospel of Thomas and things like that, and they asked a Jewish rabbi, what do you think about the historical worth of these compared to the four Gospels and actually getting us back to Jesus? They don't compare. For one, the Gnostic Gospels were written a century later, and second, the Gnostic Gospels aren't Jewish, and Jesus certainly was. It was refreshing to hear it from a rabbi.
Eddie, up to 2 minutes.
Okay, well, you see, when we're talking about miracles, Peter just said that Jesus did miracles for some people, but others want to see it, and that he can't do miracles for us because it would violate our free will. Well, it wouldn't violate my free will. If God is going to damn me to hell forever, then I believe that I should be entitled to see some proof so that I don't make the mistake of disbelief that'll wind up damning me. And if Peter says, well, then we should have free will, and it interferes with free will to God make a showing, well, then what Peter should do is Peter should say, I'm not going to threaten any of the students I teach with hell. I'm going to say that God will send you to heaven whether you believe in him or not, to make sure that you are freely believing in him so that you're not doing so under coercion of threat of hell. It's the same thing. You can't have it both ways. So as far as God not having to prove himself, why the miracles at all? Why making the sun stand still? Why all the miracles supposedly to get Jews away from Pharaoh, but no similar miracles in the 20th century to get Jews away from Hitler? This is all inexplicable. So if we are speaking about whether or not God needs to reveal himself, giving people all the evidence they need to make an informed decision is not a violation of free will. All it is fundamental fairness.
Okay, a question from over here.
Okay, Eddie,
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with most of your points here, how organized religion and everything is kind of bullshit. I'm sorry for saying this. But going back to the very, very beginning, you said, why doesn't he write his laws in our hearts or in the Bible? What if he writes his laws in physics? What if at the beginning of time, the beginning of the universe, God or some kind of higher power set the physical properties and these physical constants, which we really have no explanations for these arbitrary numbers for?
Okay, but you see, look what you said. You said that you agree with me about organized religion. So basically you're asking me about a deistic God that set things in motion, but then didn't care to communicate with us afterwards. So the question is, does this being even want relationship with us? And the God that you're positing, if it won't communicate with us through any kind of religious revelation, but just create things, is obviously not interested in us, and it makes no difference whether he exists because he's not relevant to our lives. But if in fact he did jumpstart these things, how do we know that he wasn't a process that fizzled like a chemical reaction in the beginning of the universe? Maybe God himself was the chemicals that got burnt up in the Big Bang and no longer exists. See, we don't know that. I mean, do you see what you're getting at? What you're saying is maybe there's something that may not even exist now, but that started it, and the way you're phrasing it makes us a light on a really irrelevant being. My point is that there is nothing about the constants, the parameters of the universe, which can be varied actually by latest scientific discoveries and still permit life under different constants. A bunch of articles I'll get into later. But there's nothing about the advent of the universe that cries out for a supernatural explanation. If time and space began with the Big Bang, then we can't really speak of extra causation because we only know of causation within time and space. And if it always existed, then we have an infinite regress, whether the infinite regress is time or whether the infinite regress is a supposed God who always existed. So what I'm saying is that we don't yet have evidence that the supernatural is more likely than the natural when we look around the world.
Peter, up to 2 minutes.
Yeah. To say that the origin of the universe is not a problem for the naturalists is to fail to address the issues that I raised. To say that, well, it just happened. What do you mean it just happened? If there needs to be some explanation, it seems to be something beyond physics. Now, naturalists will say maybe there was a space-time froth or something like that. At least they're granting there had to be something. So there's an absolute beginning of the universe that is a severe problem for the naturalists, and to say it doesn't count for evidence, isn't true. And the problem with the second law of thermodynamics is a serious problem, because even if you have the laws of physics changing from one Big Bang to the next, the second law of thermodynamics is not like any other laws. For the second law of thermodynamics to hold, all you have to have is that there are more ways and things which can be disorder than order. So almost any imaginable physical universe will have the problem of the second law of thermodynamics, and to think that they could have gone on and on forever and you've escaped it, no, that's not the case. So there is plenty of evidence, but he keeps insisting that we have to have something irrefutable to us today. Now, I don't think that if God were to prove that he's here, that would completely remove our free will. But I think, in fact, there are reasons why we don't have that kind of demonstration of God. If God were to show himself in his full glory, I think we'd be toast. All of us are creatures who are sinful, and nothing can be in the direct presence of God and endure given God's holiness. That's something that I think the Bible teaches. So therefore, God, out of his grace and mercy, keeps a distance from us. The question is, how much evidence does God have to give us? Even if he gave us really dramatic evidence, that wouldn't necessarily make us trust him. We have been given enough evidence to be able to act on, I would maintain. And if we don't do so, he says, well, they'll all be sent to hell forever. I haven't even addressed the topic of hell, which I may do in my final quotation, final statement. But it doesn't seem to me as though an omnipotent God is under any obligation to make his existence obvious to us any more than in Star Trek, the prime imperative required that you had to make your existence known to every developing civilization.
Thank you. Question over here.
Dr. Payne, I'd like to give you another chance to answer a question I felt went inadequately responded to. In your opening statements, you spoke of the emergence of consciousness and the conceptual gap between mental and physical states. Eddie responded in his opening statements by speaking of our physical dependence on the brain, the idea that if we lose 25% of our brain, then we lose 25% of our consciousness. If Jack Nicholson is given a lobotomy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he doesn't have consciousness. He can't do anything but lie in his hospital bed and drool and stare at Nurse Ratched. My question is, how do you reconcile this with your professed belief that after 100% of our brain stops functioning, you suddenly have full consciousness spring out into some sort of an afterlife?
It's because I think that the consciousness I will have after I die will be embodied consciousness. The question is there some essence to me which God can in fact use and carry over and to put into a new body? Whether or not you think there is anything which is an essence, it depends heavily on whether you think that mind is simply reducible down to the material. So I suggest there's two ways of looking at it. One is to say that there is a dual substance, but they're not independent of one another. Oftentimes people think substance dualism means that you just have a mind controlling the brain and pulling levers. No, that's not the case. Even Descartes didn't think that. The other approach is to say there's something metaphysically fundamental that can bridge this conceptual gap. And it's that leads us to think there's maybe something in mind, it's in the world itself. When Eddie says, well, you don't give any explanation how God could think or act, to ask how he does it, what the mechanism is, say, well, God has to be material. But he's simply dismissing the possibility of God at all. God is metaphysically very different than us. So yes, in fact, our minds are dependent upon our brains. The question is could we exist beyond this? I think the enigma of consciousness leaves that door open. My conviction that actually happened rests on the evidence for the resurrection, which I think is significant. One's not going to be persuaded if one buys into the kind of arguments Eddie gives that every naturalistic explanation would be more probable. But there is, in fact, quite a strong case for the surprisingly strong case for the resurrection of Jesus if one doesn't start off by saying that the miraculous couldn't possibly happen.
Thank you. Well, you see, look at what Peter just did. He talked about disembodied mind, but then he said that he predicts that after death, he will be in an embodied state. So without any proof, Peter says that the moment he dies, he'll be given a super Peter body that he will still be able to be conscious in. But he doesn't give any evidence of that other than the resurrection. And if the resurrection occurred, let it happen today, not in pre-scientific primitive times, so we can verify it. But if in fact God is conscious and thinking without cortical neurons firing with synapses, we need to see evidence of that, because all the evidence we have seen is that consciousness is a byproduct of a functional physical brain with operative cortical neurons and synapses. There is no evidence that consciousness can manifest without that. If it were, the anesthetic propofol that I was given in my hernia surgery wouldn't have knocked me out entirely. I would have floated above and I would have said, oh, doctor, do you have to make such a big cut? But I didn't do that. I was gone. Next thing I know, they were waking me up. Where did my consciousness go? If consciousness is not dependent on what happened to the physical brain, then how come the anesthetic eclipsed the consciousness? How come when you have advanced Alzheimer's, your consciousness is eclipsed because brain cells are disintegrating? If consciousness can exist severable from the brain, Alzheimer's would have no effect. We would still be conscious and say, well, my brain is disintegrating, but I'm still here. But the evidence shows the opposite. So again, probabilistically, it's more likely than not, there's no consciousness without a physical brain. Thank you.
Question from over here.
Sorry. So first of all, I'd like to talk about, you mentioned the Holocaust. I'd like to say, first of all, it was a horrible, horrible experience for everybody. I'm Jewish myself. But I'd like to mention that I think you're discounting the positive, not like the positive on the exterior, and not as any scientific evidence, but it seems like something so horrific, like Viktor Frankl wrote about how these men and women who were in the Holocaust suffered and endured, and some of them rose to these really high moralistic and spiritual levels that most people don't have, and most people live kind of purposelessly. So,
could you frame your question, please?
Okay, so I guess the question is, it's more of a comment, but you know, I'm thinking that.
Okay, if you don't have a question, then we'll move on.
Okay, well,
That is
I'll
a
ask the question.
I got the question.
Okay, all right,
Okay.
thank you. Let's respond.
Remember what I said. If God exists and He's all-powerful, if He's not all-powerful, then we're not talking about a God that really is relevant to the types of things we're speaking of tonight. We're just talking about the Peter Retreat God, so he doesn't have such a tough time in this debate. But if we're talking about the God that everybody knows Peter believes in, then if He's all-powerful, He has to show that with His unlimited power, He could not have prevented an even greater evil but for the Holocaust, or that the goods that He brought about could not have been brought about, even though His power is unlimited, but for the Holocaust. And that's a very high showing. For instance, you can improve people's moral character, you can improve them with boot camp, not with a concentration camp. When we train our Marines to become top-notch in fighting trim, in mind and body, we don't put them through concentration camps, we put them through boot camps. So there is a world of difference between the arduous experience that breaks you mentally and the kind of experience that makes you stronger. And my mother emerged from Auschwitz a totally broken woman. Why did God have to let her go through that? Why couldn't He have stopped it if He's all-powerful? And why didn't He explain to her why He allowed that to happen? Why didn't He explain to me if He doesn't want me running around the country promoting atheism?
I feel your pain.
Peter?
Eddie is assuming a position which I explicitly said I don't agree with. I do not think that the Holocaust happened because greater goods will come out of it. There were significant goods which came out of it, but even though significant goods could have come about with far fewer people having died. So I don't think that's the case that all evil in the world is because greater goods come out of it. My suggestion was that God, when He gave us significant moral freedom, part of what goes with that justly is that we live with the consequences. We have tremendous power for good and for evil, and God doesn't, in general, intervene and make things better. You can ask, well, why did God intervene in Egypt and bring them out of Egypt, where He didn't intervene and save the Jews then? Why didn't God intervene when it came to what happened in Ukraine, and millions of Ukrainians were starved to death by what Stalin did? God has given us, I would suggest, moral freedom, and that enables us to do horrific things. And God, in His justice, unlike us, is not free, I don't think, to just jump in and to ameliorate things. Now, He does intervene sometimes, but I think there have to be such special circumstances involved when He does that. So to say, well, there's surely no greater good that come out of it, I actually agree with that, but he thinks that if somehow God gives us free will, then God has to control the harm that I do, say, as a parent to children or people who are abusive parents. There have to be greater goods that come out rather than simply saying God has given us moral freedom, and part of the justice of that is that we live with the consequences we do, and God calls us to, in fact, counter the negative consequences best we possibly can, although God is in a different position relative to that than we are.
Thank you. We have 3 more minutes for audience questions, and it's over here. If we can make the question short and the answer short, we can have one and one.
Let's keep our time. If we're going to
Oh, you want to keep the time?
In other words, if we're going to do it, let's do it full.
So what's your pleasure? Do you want to do one more question, or
Yeah.
do you want to go to closing statements?
One more question.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
One more question from each
This one's
side?
quick.
Yeah, one more question from each side.
One more
for
question
you.
from each side? Okay, let's keep it brief, please, okay?
So I want to talk about something you could have said in response to him and something that you didn't quite touch on. First is a question of tendency. Even though there's different, even though people have different religions, people always have a tendency, even when they're not forced, they choose to experience life in a certain way, in a way that suggests more than we can see. Maybe not something supernatural, but perhaps more than we can directly experience with our senses. The second is a question of resonance, which is that if you believe something and some other text says something else, how do you know what you believe is right when they can have what they believe? And if something feels right to you, how do you know you can be the judge of that?
Peter?
Yeah, the feelings is something that gives us personal conviction about what we believe, but it's very difficult to show that what I believe is right and somebody equally intelligent to me is wrong. The fact of the matter that when two philosophers have totally different opinions on something, and they both feel that it's right, how do you adjudicate that? Well, you can't, but in fact, you live with it. You mentioned that people have this tendency to believe in something beyond themselves. It used to be at the beginning of the 20th century, people asked, well, surely religion will disappear. Well, it hasn't. A lot of atheists are saying, well, we must be hardwired to believe in God. Well, why is that? Again, a good naturalistic explanation, but the fact that we do have this adamant sort of desire to believe in God is something which accords better with theism than with naturalism.
Well, you see, let's bring this down to pure common sense. If the universe is so structured that you will be damned forever if you don't pick the right religion, then the one who damns you, who is all-powerful, does have a moral obligation to be more revealing of what that right religion is, because the consequences of getting it wrong are so grave. And if Peter says we can't question God, there's a trick here. If our reasoning is so defective that we can't even question God about the rightness or propriety of doing this, then our reason would also have to be so defective that we can't tell which religion is true, so there's no reason to believe the revelation that Peter believes, because our reasoning is so defective, we have no way of knowing. So if we can't even judge whether God is doing right or wrong by us, by withholding evidence, thereby jeopardizing our eternity, then we also have such defective reasoning that we can't know which religion is true, and it becomes even more doubly unfair to damn us for not making the right decision. And this is also the argument from divine hiddenness. So on pure common sense, again, tonight is a probabilistic debate. What I've just said makes it more likely than not that there is no God, because on common sense, if there were an all-powerful God, he would be more forthcoming of what the prerequisites are for eternal salvation than he is, and the fact that he's not doing so, even on Peter's admission, means that based on probabilities, it's more likely than not that he isn't there.
Thank you.
Okay, this will be the last question before we go to closing statements.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, you believe that the human brain is basically a biological computer. I don't really want to say computer, but basically a decision-making engine, and that the consciousness is like a phenomenon that arises out of that. And you talked about how if your brain was cut in half, your memory. Well, the thing that struck me is that you're talking about memory, and then you were calling that consciousness. And I'm not sure most people theistically believe that that's the case. They believe that you simply are conscious or you're not conscious. It's not a matter of the size of your brain. If you believe that, I'm not sure if you would believe that elephants, which are larger and have more synapses, are somehow more alive. I think most people think it's sort of a binary thing where you are alive or you aren't alive due to the possession of a soul. So I guess my question is, if your brain was destroyed right here and now, and then reconstructed atom by atom, except one atom was taken from Peter, if you would still be you, if you would still be alive, or would that be a new person born right then and there, and you would be dead?
Well, you see, that depends on whether it contains the memory of my personal history. For instance, if my brain is reconstructed but something is miswired and I have Elvis Presley's memory, I'm no longer me. But you see, even Peter agrees with me. He slipped up, but even Peter agrees with me that consciousness is dependent on the brain, because he said on numerous occasions that after he dies, he expects to be conscious because he will be embodied. He's speaking about a resurrection in a new super body that's probably, if it exists, so powerful that it would even put our former governor's physique to shame. So, but the question is there evidence that there is such a body? But you see, even Peter has to resort to an embodiment in order to speak about the perpetuation of his consciousness after the death of his physical body. So your question goes to the issue of how much me is me. Well, it depends on your theory of a reconstructed brain. How much of memories of my personal history will there be, or how much would there be other memories of other people? If, let's say that it's half me and half somebody else, it's not fully me, it's a composite. So, for instance, if it's me plus some politician, then it'll be half my memories and half the grief over losing an election, which I didn't lose, but which this other guy lost. So, once again, you're not showing that consciousness, and Peter's not showing that self-awareness can exist in a disembodied state after the we as we are now in our physical embodiment is destroyed. Remember what I said? No one has showed tonight that you can exist in a disembodied state after you die on this earth.
Peter?
Yeah, to say no one has shown that we can exist in disembodied state, well, so what? We can't prove that. That's a ridiculous thing to ask. And to talk about probabilities and to say it's a matter of probabilities is to fail to recognize that we really don't have probabilities when it comes to these philosophical, broad questions. The question, could an omnipotent, omniscient God create a world where he doesn't make himself blatantly obvious to everyone? Probabilities show that he surely doesn't exist. No, it's not probabilities. If you weigh the arguments that he's giving and think that those weigh a great deal, and you dismiss all the other arguments that say, no, you do have reason to believe that God does exist. But it's not a matter of being able to show probabilities. You talked about deficient reason. When my comment was we don't have any inductive logic that tells you how you need to weigh various evidence that you have. It's a matter of difference of opinion. It's not a matter of probabilities.
Thank you again for your attention, and now we have closing statements, and Peter, pardon me?
12 minutes.
Yes, 12 minutes closing statements. Peter will go first, and then Eddie.
Eddie has not responded to the problem of the origin of the universe. He says it's really not a problem. The dilemma that I gave, either there is a beginning or there is not. Either way, there are serious problems. He just doesn't want to give any evidence to that whatsoever. Well, why should he weigh that? I'm not sure. Maybe it's because science shows that nothing scientific nothing non-material could exist. Science hasn't shown us that. Science shows us how our physical world works. It doesn't show us whether there's anything beyond our physical world. My contention was the success of science is perfectly compatible with both theism and with naturalism. And so therefore science doesn't give us strong reason that there can't be some non-material creator of the universe. There are a variety of reasons to think there are. Look at the fine-tuning. The fine-tuning is extraordinary. You can look at one particular molecule and say even if it varied by 20%, molecules function as they do because of their structure. Well, how much can you change the electromagnetic constant before a molecule shifts from one structure to another? There may be quite a bit of leeway that way. But there are lots and lots of arguments that show the fine-tuning is incredibly tight between complex structures existing and not existing. He doesn't give that any weight whatsoever. Why? Well, it's not because science, I'm not quite sure. He thinks it's obvious that it couldn't happen. Is it simply because God hasn't made himself obvious enough? Does God not making himself perfectly obvious give you reason to think that you can discount all these other lines of evidence? And the question of personal identity at the end. Are we persons? Are we agents? Do we actually do anything? Are we just simply the products of what our brains do? He said if you took his memories and you put it into another person, well, suppose you took his memory and you put them into two people, or you took his brain and split it in half and put one into one body and one into another body. Would you have two different persons? It's very difficult from a naturalistic standpoint to say there really is any such thing as personal identity. Am I the same person that I was when I was 5 years old? I have very few of the memories the same. My thought patterns are very, very different. Physically, there's almost nothing the same. Is there any personal identity? Do I actually, as a person, make any choices? He says mind is a byproduct. Well, I would suggest that choice then is also just, there's no the agent, the person isn't actually making any choices. So if mind is just a product, it's not the I that's making choices, it's just my brain which is cranking them out. In fact, if his brain is just cranking them out, the reason why Eddie holds the views he has is not because he thinks they're more reasonable, he gives those reasons, but actually his brain forces him to believe that. So if your brain dictates what you believe, there's no way in which I can say, well, I know I'm right, because after all, I have to be able to get outside of myself and actually be able to evaluate it. And unfortunately, we don't have the objective rational calculus to be able to say, Eddie's right and I'm not. But if he's just dictated by his brain, then everything he believes, he has to believe, and everything I believe, I have to believe. So therefore, the foundation of personal agency, where I'm actually responsible, where I am making choices and I influence the course of my behavior rather than being dictated by things in the past, is something that can't be answered in naturalism. Now, the problem of free will is something that's difficult from a theistic standpoint as well, because after all, if I have two identical me's, even if I'm a spiritual me and I'm not a material me, if one of me makes one choice and the other makes another choice, why is that? How can we account for that? Well, it's only if there's something self-directive in me, and they can't give any account for it. But to think that there actually can be something self-directive, and not just driven by my past states of my brain or my body or states of myself, really only makes sense if naturalism is true. People like John Searle at Berkeley believes that we have free will, even though he's a thoroughgoing naturalist. He grants he doesn't have any grounds for it all, but he says, I believe I do it. In the past, Eddie has said, well, do I have free will? Look, I can move my hand. That doesn't demonstrate I have free will. So from a naturalist standpoint, no one's ever really responsible for anything they do, not even the beliefs that they have right now. So how is it that reason is able to function in a sort of a plane above the biology? There's no explanation for that whatsoever. Is it somewhere we'll be able to wend them together? To simply talk about it as a byproduct does not help at all. I have to say something about what will happen to us when we die. Well, I think that if God has revealed himself to us in Scripture, and I think he's told us that what we do in this life does affect where we end up. Now, I don't think that we end up in hell because God is just vindictive and wants to punish us. I think that the only way in which we'll be brought back in a relationship with God is if we, in fact, are made pure and holy, and we can't do that in and of ourselves. If we're made holy by Christ's holiness, then, in fact, we can be brought back in a relationship with God. Who will benefit from Christ's righteousness? Is it only those who have explicit faith in Christ? That's a hard question, but it does appear quite clear to me that the gospel is very important in teaching people about the love of God and having people come to know him. And if they have that union, that trust in God, whether it be explicitly about Jesus or whether it's implicitly and God recognizes that they will be in heaven. But people who haven't, how can God punish them forever if he didn't make it perfectly clear that he exists? I suggest that if you're apart from God, the simplest definition of hell is that you're completely removed from the presence of God, and hence if all good comes from God, then in fact there's nothing good in you that is salvageable. You're really no different than the demonic. There's nothing which could be redeemable. So as God condemns people to an eternity apart from himself simply because he wishes to? No, I don't think that's the case. And if we're separated from God's goodness, you're not really human after that. You have no more chance of responding to God's grace than demons do who don't have anything good within them. There are a fair number of Christians today who buy into the position of annihilationism, which I don't, but I think is a position which at least a fair biblical case can be made for it, and I think it might be correct, even though I don't buy into it. If annihilationism is correct, then his whole argument that surely God has to give us clear evidence, otherwise it wouldn't be fair for us to be condemned for eternity in hell. And no, if annihilation is the case, we haven't given a chance to respond, and it's how we respond to God, not just simply how we respond to the explicit revelation we've been given that determines it, but it's our connection with Jesus ultimately that puts us in a relationship with God where in fact we can have intimate relation with God and not simply be destroyed in the presence of pure and holy God. How am I at time? The timekeeper?
You still have about 5 minutes.
Okay, about 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, in terms of I keep going back and forth between the God of the Bible, and he keeps, quotes this thing about what we can know about God. I think, philosophically speaking, a good argument can be made from the apparent fine-tuning. That was my doctoral dissertation. Would it convince me if there was no other argument? No, I don't think so. But it wouldn't tell me that God is a God I should trust. What about the origin of the universe? Does that point towards something? Yes, it does. Is it significant? Well, it's significant. It shows that something supernatural may well exist. Am I convinced of the case? Well, no, not necessarily. But it's a significant argument. If you're left with a variety of significant arguments, then you're left with a significant possibility there might be something supernatural. And to simply say nothing supernatural exists, so therefore you can reject it, is to misunderstand my whole argument. My whole argument has been that there are a variety of reasons that give us reason to believe the natural world is not all that there is. And on the basis of that, if you combine that with what God has revealed to us in Scripture, the evidence for the resurrection, then you don't come at the evidence of the resurrection and say, well, it couldn't possibly be happening because it's a miracle. Eddie hasn't budged at all in his adamance about the impossibility of miracles, but his argument that they conflict with themselves, I said that no, that's confusion of thinking that somehow belief in miracles is a denial of laws of nature when it's not. So to think that you have this huge weight of evidence on laws of nature and to believe in miracles is to contradict the laws of nature. No! Everybody who's a Christian who takes seriously the possibility of miracles at all takes seriously the fact there is an order of nature. And it will be without exception unless there's something overriding it. But when you entertain the possibility that there might be, then one takes the question of miracles much more seriously. And that's why all this background data is so crucial. If you don't have this background data, no reason to believe that there's something beyond the physical world, then it's too easy to simply dismiss it and say, well, there must be some naturalistic explanation. But if you have reason to believe that there's something beyond this world, even though it's not a whole lot to go on, and I wouldn't say I'm 100% sure that even the general arguments work, they have enough plausibility that lends background to the credence that Jesus may, in fact, have risen from the dead and things like that. So it's not switching back and forth between the two. He wants to put me in the position of saying, well, in the end, he grants that we're embodied. No, we're finite creatures. And look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament, all the talk about we're embodied creatures. In fact, some people say that's really only Paul in the New Testament that comes up with this notion that you might have disembodiment, absent from the body, present with the Lord. But even Paul can be absent from this body and present with the Lord in some other body. The question is the nature of mind such that we know it's nothing but the brain? If the brain disappears, then clearly we disappear if that's the case. But no, I've suggested, in fact, the enigma of consciousness and the arguments we have for some non-material mind, God, in fact, give us reason for believing that we may. Would that by itself convince me that there's life after death? No, if it weren't for the fact that I believe Jesus actually rose from the dead. He says, well, shouldn't Jesus do it again? Well, no, it only happened once because Jesus only had to die once. Why is it that God would send his son to the cross just over again to satisfy skeptics like Eddie and say, oh, you have to demonstrate it to me? I think an awful lot of skeptics would say, oh, that's a trick. It doesn't show that God exists. It doesn't show that he's all good. All it showed was something supernatural happened, so I'm willing to grant that, but I'm not willing to grant the God of the Bible. And even if a person claims to be Jesus, maybe some alien that has a bias for Christianity or other religions. So it doesn't prove anything. What you're left with is evidence, and we have to weigh it as best we can as individuals reflecting on it. And if you think the fact that God doesn't make himself perfectly obvious to us is demonstration that God doesn't exist at all or he doesn't care, and negate all the reasons that we have for believing that he does care and that he does act in this world, you are in fact just going with your assumption or your bias. And I think it's rooted in this sort of, well, believing in the supernatural is crazy. It's kind of like the person who says, well, I don't believe there could be any aliens because after all these people who talk about it are just loonies. And there are an awful lot of Christians out there who believe far too much, who believe things they shouldn't believe. There needs to be a degree of skepticism because there are a lot of false reports of miracles. But the fact there are a lot of false reports out there is irrelevant to whether or not they could actually happen. And when it comes down to your own experience, there's no objective way of saying you probably should discount that as being purely subjective. No, experience is crucial. In fact, all that we believe is ultimately based on experience. And hence you need to take that seriously as well. So when it comes down to the question, will I believe the God of the Bible? There's the auxiliary question of, is it reasonable to believe there's something supernatural at all? And I've argued that yes, there is. When you add the reason to believe the God of the Bible is there, it's not as though you have a different God. It's that what you have in the other arguments is a minimal description of God. Namely, he's very powerful, all-powerful, no, not necessarily. Is he all-knowing? Well, we don't really know very much, but at least he was able to create a world knowing enough how to create it so that it actually would bring about life as we know it. This world is precariously balanced. They say, well, that's no evidence. Even naturalists will say, given the apparent fine-tuning of natural laws, very unlikely that radically different laws would be life permitting. It'd be like here we have everything around us is unhospitable life, but maybe off here somewhere else, radically different life, you wouldn't have this fine-tuning. The fact that you have fine-tuning here indicates that to have life at all, you have to have fine-tuning. And I would suggest that believing that God fine-tune it is a reasonable response, even though you can't prove it and you don't have the kind of proof which Eddie demands.
Okay, thank you. Eddie?
Peter has accused me of speaking in absolutist terms. I haven't. I've said my arguments are probabilistic. I began by saying that we have absolute proof of the natural world, and that's a given. We don't have proof of the supernatural, and Peter had the burden of proof to show that nature must be undergirded by supernature. And I believe that the weight of the evidence cuts against that in favor of naturalism, because he's been able to adduce no evidence of supernaturalism that outweighs naturalism. Now, in terms of the origin of the universe, he was not able to show how a magical being did it. And so that leaves his assertion unproven. My point was that if God always existed into an infinite past, so could the universe. If the Big Bang indeed was the inception of time and space, then we can't right now speak of understandable A causes B prior to the Big Bang, because you need time and space for cause and effect to play out. Also, when we crash big atoms into each other in particle accelerators, they break into a mess of particles, and it turns out that the ratio among these different particles, every time we do this, is exactly the same ratio of particles that we determined have come out of the Big Bang. So the Big Bang looks exactly like what happens when you squeeze a big enough atom until it explodes. So that shows that there is a naturalistic model for what could have happened. It's not necessarily so, but the naturalistic explanation always carries more weight than the supernatural explanation. And when he speaks about the fine-tuning of the universe, again, he didn't address my contention that there is a severe conflict between the design argument and the fine-tuning argument, because if God is omnipotent and so perfectly designed the universe, it wouldn't have been necessary to have it balanced so precariously. But even so, when he said that these parameters are so tight that there can't be any variance, it's not true. Dr. Victor Stenger adjusted the parameters in a computer simulation, the electromagnetic interaction, the strong nuclear interaction strength at low energy, the mass of the electron, and the mass of the proton. And he was able to show 100 universes in which the values of these 4 parameters were generated randomly from a range of 5 orders of magnitude above to 5 orders below their values in our universe, and they still allowed for stars long enough to cook the heavy elements like carbon. So Peter has not shown that. He talked about the second law of thermodynamics, but it's inapplicable here, because the second law of thermodynamics will result in entropy or disorder only in a closed system. But we know the universe is expanding because the galaxies are receding from each other in what we know as the redshift from the Big Bang. So obviously, we are not in a closed system in our region of the universe, and so it's not like something in a test tube. Now, he spoke about our free will. Well, first of all, why is free will so great that God would allow the most horrendous things to happen just so we could exercise our free will? And if free will is so great, is there free will in heaven? Why don't the angels have free will to do wrong? Why doesn't God have free will to do wrong? I mean, this is no answer. And now, as far as the question of evil is concerned, remember, I'm not saying it is logically impossible for there to be a God with all the evil in the world. I'm saying probabilistically it is far more likely than not that the unexplained suffering that we undergo on this planet, both natural and caused by each other, is what you would expect if there was no God governing the world. Now, he spoke about the fall of Adam and Eve. Well, that is unlikely, because that means that Adam and Eve were created spontaneously, but we know that humans came from evolution, and Peter didn't at all dispute that. Now, he talks about consciousness existing separate from the brain, but yet he still lingers on his embodied state after death. If consciousness could be free of the brain, how come it is eclipsed by a blow on the head or an anesthetic? Now, he talked about Scripture having revealed Jesus' resurrection, and that God doesn't have to do it again. It is highly suspect that if it occurred, the most important event in human history occurred in ancient primitive times, in pre-scientific times, and that it was written about 40 to 50 years later by people who weren't even eyewitnesses. This is very suspect. Also, some common sense here. If I tell Peter that an Indian guru I used to study with in my New Age days levitated to the ceiling, and I bring 10 people to attest to it, Peter would not believe it. So Peter is essentially saying, as most religious people do, my unproven supernatural miracle is stronger than your unproven supernatural miracle. And as far as the prospect that we are annihilated at death and don't suffer eternally, well, I mean, this is a problem with Peter and with his Bible. It talks about eternal suffering. It talks about a burning forever. Most fundamentalist Christians believe that there is a torment. If you take where William Lane Craig teaches at Biola University, their credo is that you suffer torment forever, that you're not annihilated. So Peter better engage in a debate with his fellow Christians if annihilation is even an option, which it apparently is not. Now, when he talks about something beyond, remember, my argument was probabilistic. My argument is that the weight of the universe shows that it's more likely than not that there was no fine-tuner. Let me quote from an article in Scientific American that shows that different constants could still allow for life. It says, for instance, if deuterium substituting for hydrogen-1 were the case, oceans would be made heavier than they are now, and that would be subtly different, but that would still allow for life. So once again, as with Dr. Stenger's monkey god experiment, and with Professor Weinberg, the Nobel laureate, showing that in terms of the creation of carbon, there's a 20% range, that shows it's not so finely tuned. It's not so tight. Now, Peter talks about religious experience in his point number 13. Well, that's very subjective. Nobody here who has claimed to have a religious experience can claim that it is the same as speaking to another person. In fact, Peter writes in his online articles that one of the reasons why Paul converted was because of the blinding experience of Jesus on the road to Damascus. So Peter is admitting that you need a miraculous event for conversion. And if Paul had that, why don't we have it? Also, that itself is ambiguous. If the Bible is supposed to be clear and free of defect, how come it didn't tell us if it was just a blinding light or if it was the physical appearance of the body of Jesus? He doesn't go into that at all. So basically, what Peter is telling all of you to do without adequate evidence is to believe that a cosmic Jewish zombie who was his own father can make you live forever if you telepathically tell him you accept him as your master, so that he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in all of us because a woman made out of a man's rib was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. And what I'm saying is that if you want to make this assertion, which he has in tonight's debate, you need to bring more evidence to bear. Because again, the argument from religious confusion, if we don't have barriers to believing in the supernatural, how do we choose which supernatural claim is true and which isn't? In the 1980s, 3 medical doctors from India living in Los Angeles, 4 of them swore to me that their guru visiting from India levitated to the ceiling. I didn't believe them. But why should their testimony be less credible than that of those in ancient times who claimed they saw Jesus rise? Why should medical doctors who testify to overt miracle violation levitation, why should they be disbelieved, but claims of resurrection be believed? You see, Peter also, in his argument, failed to instruct us on how we differentiate one paranormal claim from another. So what Peter needed to do, which he failed to do in tonight's debate, is to demonstrate how, when competing supernatural claims are clashing with each other for the allegiance of modern human beings, how we are supposed to choose among them. He didn't give us a mechanism for, even if he were able to establish the likelihood of the supernatural, for choosing which supernatural is more likely than any other supernatural. Also, again, Peter admitted that the fine-tuning argument alone wouldn't be enough to persuade him as to God's existence. Why was that? If the fine-tuning argument is what Peter says it does and does the heavy lifting that it says, it should do so. But he himself admitted that in and of itself it wouldn't be sufficient to establish the God he believes in. And so you look at the experiments I just cited, but again, I must reiterate what I said in my first rebuttal. Either way, the fine-tuning argument fails to make it more likely than not that an otherwise unproven supernatural being exists. If this is the only universe we have, we can't say, aha, the likelihood is 10 billion to 1 because we have nothing to compare it to. If I don't know how many aces are in the deck and how many cards are in the deck, I can't predict the same probability as if I know there are 4 aces and 52 cards. But if there's a multiverse and billions of universes, then the likelihood that a universe with our constants would arise by accident is far more likely. Peter is saying, well, the fact that the meteorite hit the Earth 65 million years ago, eliminating the dinosaurs so we mammals could appear, would be an act of God. Well, no, it was an accident. So why couldn't all these other events be accidents? Again, based on the weight of the evidence in our physical world, I believe I have prevailed at showing on balance it is more likely than not that the universe is natural, not supernatural, which means it's more likely than not that a supernatural God does not exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've been a very attentive and respectful audience. We appreciate it. Give the two gentlemen a hand, give yourselves a hand, and we are adjourned.